BA Blocks, brought to you by Learn.ba.
I've talked in previous videos about the differences between becoming a freelance business analyst and becoming a permanent full-time employee as a business analyst, right? And in this video, what I want to do is I want to give you some insight into how the employer thinks about this, how the hiring manager is thinking when they're hiring a freelance analyst versus when they're hiring somebody on a permanent basis. Okay, so their priorities are quite different when it comes to hiring people on a contract basis versus when they're trying to hire somebody to stay for the long run. And so it's important for you to understand this, because when you go into an interview, you have to have a good idea of how your hiring manager or how the employer is thinking about the situation you're in. So if you walk into an interview, let's say for a business analyst that's on a permanent basis, they're going to be thinking one way. But if you walk into an interview where they're looking to hire you just on a contract basis, they're going to be thinking slightly differently. Okay. And so the three factors that I'm going to talk about are skill set. So that's one of the things that they look for. Number two is compatibility. And number three is work ethic. Okay. And the order in which they prioritize these changes depending on whether they're looking for somebody on contract versus whether they're looking for somebody on a permanent basis. Okay. So let's talk first about the permanent employee. By and large, most business analysts out there are permanent employees of companies. There is a trend towards people becoming a lot more freelance, but if you scan the marketplace for job applications today, or you see what job openings are, most of those job openings are for permanent employees. But there is a shift towards more contract, but I'll talk about that in another video. So let's talk about how the employer is thinking, how the hiring manager is thinking when they are hiring somebody on a permanent basis. Okay, and the priorities might not necessarily be what you might expect. Okay, I think a lot of people might expect the employer to be thinking of skill set as the top priority regardless of the situation. And for most permanent employee hires, that's not the case, because the top priority that most hiring managers have is compatibility. Okay, and I'll explain to you why that is. So hiring managers look for compatibility first in most cases, then they look for skill set, and then they look for work ethic. Okay, and the reason why they do that is because the skill set problem is a relatively easy problem for them to solve. So if they find somebody who they know is going to be very compatible with the team that they have right now and with the organization at large, they're going to most likely lean towards hiring that type of a person than if they had a candidate where the person has a lot of skill set, but it's going to be very difficult to get this person to work with the folks inside their company, right? And so when they're hiring somebody on a full-time permanent basis, or on any kind of permanent basis, compatibility is typically the first priority, because the skill set problem, again, is something that they can solve by spending a couple of $1,000s and getting a person trained. If they know that the person is staying for the long run, the compatibility problem is a much more difficult problem to solve, because it's very difficult for a hiring manager to get people to like each other and to work with each other, right? But it's much easier for them to hire somebody who they know is going to fit in very well inside their organization and is going to be able to work at the same pace and work in a congenial way with the other employees, but they might just need some sharpening of the skills. Most hiring managers would rather hire that person. And work ethic is very high on the list. It's still part of the top three priorities, but work ethic is also very important. And I'll talk about work ethic a little bit more if I have some time in this video. So those are the priorities that management has when they're hiring somebody on a permanent basis. When they're hiring somebody on a contract basis, those priorities shift a little bit, because the compatibility isn't as big of an issue. What they're normally hiring for when they're looking for contract workers or for consultants is they're looking for skills first. They're usually looking to make sure that you can come in a very short period of time, do the work, and you might not necessarily jive very well with the organizational culture or with a lot of the other employees there, but that's not really a huge issue for them because they know you're not sticking around, right? And so the priorities shift a little bit. And so normally when they're hiring consultants, they're looking for skill first. They're looking probably for work ethic second and compatibility third, right? And so things kind of get flipped on their head when they're hiring you as a consultant or a contractor versus if they're trying to hire you on a permanent basis. So that prioritization of the hiring manager's factors, the things that they're looking for, is very important for you to understand when you walk into an interview. Because when you walk in, let's say you're being interviewed for, let's say, a permanent position, you walk in and you focus exclusively on your skills. You might have a lot of skills that you've accumulated over the last, 5, 10, 15 years, however long you've been working. If you're focusing strictly on your skills, but they're trying to gauge whether you're going to fit into their team and whether you're actually going to be able to deal with the personalities that their stakeholders have, you're unlikely to shine as much as you would like to in that interview, right? Because what they're looking for is to see whether you're going to fit in, and then they're looking for skills, and you're focusing a lot of the conversation around skills, right? So understand that difference, because when you walk into that interview, try to gauge it out a little bit to see whether what those priorities are. Very likely that they're going to be looking for fit before they look for skills. Even though those questions in the actual interview might come later on in the process, they might see whether you have the skills and then gauge your fit, right? So the sequence in which they ask you the questions might not necessarily lead to that, but there are other things that can give away that tell to say that this employer is looking for fit rather than skill set. Let me talk a little bit about work ethic. Okay, work ethic is something that I think a lot of people don't think about when they're walking into an interview, right? And the importance of work ethic for an employer makes a difference between whether a job gets done or whether a job doesn't get done, given the pressures that exist. So people who have a very weak work ethic will tend to give up trying to solve a problem very early, right? And so if they see a challenge in front of them and they say, hey, it looks like it's too big of a problem, I'm just going to kind of move on to something else. The work ethic issue here is something that needs to be considered very strongly. Again, it is part of the top 3 priorities that employers have. But when you're thinking about work ethic, you have to kind of gauge yourself based on how hard do you work, how much effort do you put in, how quickly do you give up, right, before you try to solve a problem. And so when you're thinking about your work ethic, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have the ability to solve the problem on your own. It means that you do not give up on a problem very easily, right? Giving up has to be your last option when it comes to work ethic, as opposed to being one of your first options, right? So let's say, for example, if you've been hired in a full-time capacity and you're working across a couple of different projects, or you're maintaining a couple of different solutions, so you're doing enhancement work on a number of different solutions. If you don't have a strong work ethic, you're going to shy away from the difficult problems, and you're going to tend to work a lot more on the problems that you know how to solve. And employers don't really like that, because they want to see you be able to solve the problems that are of the highest priority. And in an organization where the prioritization is a little bit loose, so it's up to the analysts to try to figure out where they should be doing their work, work ethic becomes really, really important, because now they're leaving it to the analysts to decide what problems to solve before the other ones. And if you have somebody who doesn't have as strong of a work ethic, they're going to tend to neglect the work that actually needs to get done because it's too challenging, right? So I'll talk about how you can develop work ethic, to a much stronger work ethic, in a different video, but it is one of the top 3 things that employers look for, and they'll have certain tests in an interview to try to test your work ethic, even though it's a very difficult thing to test for. So I'll leave the video there, but understand that there are the priorities shift if you're trying to get hired for a permanent employee versus if you're being hired for a freelancer. And I will see you on the next video.